Welcome to Winston's Cellar. Relax, listen, enjoy.
The Monitor by John Richard DeRose. It was a strange machine, no moving parts to speak of, but instinctively, he knew it was a machine. He moved around it slowly, circumspectly, not quite sure what to do or where to start. It didn't look any different from how it had last week, or last month, or last year, or even 10 years ago. But it was different. It was different in one simple aspect. This awareness of its continued presence. It was commonplace in appearance, nothing special, safe within its own prosaic existence. Perhaps that was the secret to its longevity, its strange ability to endure on, and it was a box, a large metal box planted in the earth and standing about waist high. Each of its four sides measured exactly 18 inches wide. The top was flat, and it was completely devoid of any bolts, rivets, vents, hinges, handles, or knobs. Its only peculiarity was an odd marking, a slightly elevated pentagon, almost in bas-relief, on the side facing east. The symbol could not be called a perfect pentagon. Each side was a different length from the others, giving a strange, lopsided appearance. It was odd, but not exceptional, nothing that would capture anyone's interest more than a couple of seconds. In the cool morning air, Robert Morgan walked around the box, rubbing his fingers gently across the rough surface and rapping his knuckles on selected spots, testing for the solidity or hollowness of its interior. He occasionally stopped to read some of the colorful graffiti that had collected on every square inch of its metal frame. He looked for his own name, written at the age of 9 during a hunting trip with his father, but it had been obliterated by a dozen other names and remarks in bolder print. He reached down and peeled off a long strip of the old Forest Service green paint, exposing the dull gray surface beneath. It was probably painted by some teenage summer employee of the Forest Service, some kid who was told to paint everything that wasn't put there by nature itself. Robert Morgan continued to walk slow revolutions around the box, wondering and remembering. When was the first time that he saw this thing? Was it on that hunting trip with his father, hiking with his brother, or maybe that time with his scout troop when they camped in this same clearing? The time they used the box as a target during their rock-throwing contest. He smiled at all the old thoughts and good memories. He couldn't remember the first time he had seen this box, and it really didn't matter. It was here, and always had been. No one thought much about the purpose of the box, always assuming that it was one of those ugly pieces of equipment belonging to a public utility, or perhaps the Forest Service. Everyone just naturally figured that it was some sort of dull mechanical monitor for an underground gas line or electrical cable. Or maybe it was some kind of sensory device for forest fires or the level of the water table. It was simply another one of those strange metal boxes sticking out of the ground in the middle of the forest making. You realize that it isn't quite the wilderness that you thought it was. He stopped, knelt down on the east side of the box and examined the pentagon. This strange symbol is what started him thinking about the box and its purpose. Yesterday's paper had carried a story about the unearthing of an ancient totem, a relic found during the excavation of a soon-to-be reservoir. The wood of the totem was almost petrified, and experts estimated an age of well over 2,000 years. It was a major discovery, an archaeological treasure that commanded front-page coverage and a large color photograph to accompany the article. It was this photograph that caught and held Robert Morgan's attention. The totem was pictured next to its discoverer. It stood 8 feet high, and it was composed of various deities and sacred animals stacked, one on top of another, in the order of their power or importance, from bottom to top. This hoary chain of authority proceeded from a bear-like god up through 5 other forms to a large eagle. And there, above the eagle, at the very summit of the pole, sat a carved replica of a square box, with a strange and lopsided pentagon on one side. Robert Morgan was an engineer, and had the pragmatic eye of a man who had spent most of his life seeing the logic and practicality behind shapes and forms. The square, straight-lined, right-angled architecture of the upper deity seemed strange atop the grouping of nature's designs. And then his eyes focused on the misshaped Pentagon symbol he had seen only one other place in his lifetime. An umbilical of thought grew within his mind, connecting the totem with the old metal box. After seeing that picture in his morning paper, he spent the rest of the day making phone calls. He needed to prove to himself that the strange connection was nothing more than a bizarre coincidence. He had to find the owner of the box, and he had to identify the purpose for its years of existence. The Forest Service stated that the box was not theirs, but most likely belonged to one of the utilities and should be left alone. Each one of the utility companies denied having any equipment in that area of the forest. Each suggested that it probably belonged to one of the others, and they all agreed that it must have some purpose and should be left alone. The city, county, state, and even the Department of the Interior refused to claim it, but they all had the same advice to offer. It was there for a reason, so leave it alone. His final call went to the military. They immediately disavowed any knowledge of defense equipment installed on national forest property, but added that if it was a piece of military hardware, then it should be left alone. Robert Morgan finally realized that the box did not belong to anyone. He tried to contact the archaeologist who discovered the totem, but the man was famous now and would not return the calls of some fool who wanted to detract from his discovery with a crazy sidebar about a metal box in the forest. The box, the machine belonged to Robert Morgan, and it was time to find out exactly what it was. He had brought his tools, but they were useless. There was nothing to place a tool onto, or to stick a tool into, or to slip a tool under nothing. Nothing at all. The seams of each corner were so close that not even a razor blade could fit between them, and the metal was so strong that it could withstand any blow from a hammer or the pull from the winch of a truck. He knew these things wouldn't work, because a local mechanic had tried them before. The mechanic's name was Billy Jessup. He thought that he could steal some extra power by running a cable from this box down the mountain and to his gas station on the frontage road. Billy began with a blowtorch, which burned off some paint and blackened the grayish metal beneath, but never melted a single molecule. He tried to dig below the box, but claimed it went down into solid rock. He resorted to the sledgehammer and his truck's winch breaking both. Forest rangers finally arrested him while he was placing a bag of gunpowder at the base of the box. In his frustration, he confessed to all his acts and was prosecuted for tampering with the property of a public utility or the government. No one knew exactly whose property was tampered with, but the court figured that the box must have some purpose and should be left alone. Morgan examined the box for over an hour, trying to find some means of entrance. He decided that the secret had to be in the Pentagon, so he tried pushing, pulling, and sliding one of the configuration sides, but nothing happened. He was very systematic in his methods, trying the same procedures on each side of the symbol. It happened on the fourth try. The bar swung out to a right angle of its original position with a definite click. He tried sliding the fifth side of the Pentagon, but it would not move. He retried the previous three sides, and another bar moved out to 90 degrees from its original position. He noticed that the first side of the emblem to move was also the shortest in length, and the second side to move was the next shortest to pattern. He attempted each of the remaining sides in order of their length, from short to long. Each side moved in succession to the next, clicking into a right angle from its former position. Upon moving the final piece of the Pentagon, the entire side of the metal box began to slide slowly downward into the earth. Inside the box was another panel, with an elevated hexagon facing outward. Morgan was puzzled. He had figured out the secret of the Pentagon-shaped emblem, and succeeded in opening the box. But now there was another panel behind the first, another door to hide the mystery of the box. It was like opening a safe and finding a second safe inside. This inner panel, like the outer one, was covered with graffiti, but of a different sort. These markings, encircling the hexagon, were Indian pictographs. As for the hexagon itself, like the Pentagon, it wasn't perfect. Each side of the emblem was a different length, giving it an odd off-center appearance. It was another puzzle to solve, another step toward the inside of the machine. It only took a few minutes to open this second panel, since it followed the same basic pattern as the Pentagon. There was only one difference. It worked backwards. The longer sides were moved first, long to short, and as the last side of the hexagon clicked into its angled position, the panel glided slowly down. The grayness of another panel waited behind. Robert Morgan leaned back and stared at the box, letting the single question race through his mind. Was this some sort of elaborate strongbox, with various security combinations to decode before entrance was permitted? In spite of their terrific strength, each panel was paper-thin, molding perfectly against one another. 2 panels had already dropped, and still less than 1/8 of an inch had been detracted from the width of the box. The origin of the machine was beyond contemplation. It leapt past the borders of imagination, and Robert Morgan was a practical man who lived within the boundaries of engineering realities. The engineer put aside the question and concentrated on the 3rd panel. Like the previous 2, this panel was covered with writings and markings. Most of the marks were obliterated, but a couple of legible lines still remained. The words were in Spanish, Caja de Dios. Morgan remembered some of his high school Spanish. Box of God, he whispered to himself. Under the strange words was a name and date, Leon, 1594. In the center of this 3rd panel were 16 levers, arranged in 2 octagon-shaped emblems, and once again they were odd and imperfect. Something new was added to the multiple levers, a single button in the middle of each octagon. It took Morgan less than 10 minutes to solve this new puzzle. These buttons released the levers of each octagon, and the levers were moved, as on the previous panels. The levers of one octagon were moved from shortest to longest, and those of the other octagon were moved from longest to shortest. When the last lever clicked into place, the gray panel slid downward into the earth, and behind it was the familiar visage of another panel. This 4th panel was also covered with graffiti, but this writing was done with a coarse instrument and had been smudged by the closeness of the panels sliding against one another. Here was another series of levers, 30 in all, arranged in 3 decagons, 2 perfect and 1 imperfect. Along with these levers were several buttons and something new added, an electrical type switch. By following the pattern established on the mechanics of the former panels and a little trial and error with the new equipment, Robert Morgan was able to penetrate the 4th panel in less than 15 minutes. His hopes of entrance into the machine were once more suspended as the thin door slid down into the earth and offered nothing more than a 5th obstacle to overcome. Again, obliterated graffiti surrounded a number of switches, buttons, and levers, all arranged in intricate polygonal designs. As before, the panel was opened only by following a certain pattern of procedure, based on the other patterns established in the previous solutions. And some new device had been added, something requiring a little more analytical thought and more trial and error. The 5th panel took 17 minutes to open and exposed another gray slab of metal. This same procedure continued for 6 more panels, with each new panel offering a canvas of markings and writings. These writings contained occasional names and dates that were somewhat readable, with each date being more recent than the previous one, 1630, 1689, 1707. Something else became more progressive, also the difficulty and complexity of the many mechanical puzzles on each succeeding panel. The length of time required to solve these puzzles and breach the panels also increased. The nature of the locking or unlocking devices seemed to advance through different stages or eras of technology, going from simple to complex mechanics, on to hydraulics, then to electrical, and finally into chemical combinations. The 11th through 17th panels offered opening sequences composed of all these various technologies, each more challenging than the one before, and each exacting more time and thought than the previous panel. These 7 panels had one more thing in common: the almost complete absence of graffiti. Only 2 initials adorned each panel, both written in black paint, TE. The 17th panel took exactly 56 minutes to decipher and open. It was mid-morning, and as Robert Morgan sat in the shrinking shade of the metal box, watching this last panel slide slowly downward, his eyes opened wider, and his breath grew shallow. There before him was door number 18, with all the usual myriad of instrumentation. But his eyes were not directed at these new conundrums. Instead, they stared at a small line of writing. in the familiar black paint. I can go no farther. Good luck. Below this single line was a date and a signature, the name of the man who had placed his initials on the 7 former panels. T. Edison, July 19th, 1921. It took Robert Morgan several minutes to fully believe what he had just read. In a way, it was obvious, and yet he had never realized what it all meant. The graffiti on each of the panels were the signatures and comments of other people who had tried to open this box, other people who had wanted to find the secret of this strange machine. Every name and every date represented a person who had gone as far as they possibly could into the depths of the box. These markings were placed on the final panel that held a technology beyond the learning or understanding of the man or woman who scribbled his or her signature on the dull metal. And T. Edison was the last, going farther than any other before him. Morgan examined the locking mechanisms of the newest panel, realizing for the first time exactly how far he had come. He had understood and unraveled an entire scope of scientific and mathematical puzzles. His education and experience as an engineer had given him the ability to infiltrate this far into the machine, but he wasn't sure how much farther he could go. Many new advances in the various fields of science had been made since the year 1921. Whether or not they were sufficient to enable him to open all the panels and finally discover the contents of the box was yet to be seen. He checked his watch. It was already 10:30 in the morning. He rested for a moment and then concentrated his full attention on the next panel. Many of the necessary patterns needed to open the doors were embedded in his memory, with all their various combinations and sequences. However, this panel offered new and more complex intricacies that taxed both his mental and physical endurance. There were a dozen chemical components which needed to be shifted and mixed in perfect order. These components were encased in glass tubes fitted flush with the panel, and they were operated by either electrical switches or a type of heat-sensitive filament which would expand or contract with the touch of a finger. There were balance bubbles in mercury, and another heavy liquid, perhaps nickel, which were attached to an array of light sensors, pressure bars, and magnetic flux changers. Sweat poured down Morgan's forehead and dripped through his grayish-black eyebrows, causing him to squint and pinch the stinging moisture from the corners of his eyes. He worked for 1 hour and 12 minutes before the panel opened, and there behind was door number 19, with a whole new display of instrumentation. But this time, there were no markings, no initials, no dates or names of any sort. No one had ever gone this far. No one had ever seen panel 19 or been faced with the task of trying to open it. Both elation and depression struggled for the upper hand in Robert Morgan's mind. He felt good at being the first to penetrate this far into the machine, but he was also becoming somewhat discouraged with the endless train of combinations that seemed to take him nowhere near the inside of the machine. He shook his head and rubbed his tired eyes. He had to rest. He needed a break from all the mental pressure that he had forced on himself. He stretched his long legs out in front of him and leaned back against a soft mound of grassy turf. He closed his eyes with the intention of resting for only a few minutes, but soon fell fast asleep. There was a loud clicking noise echoing through the stillness of the surrounding forest. Morgan sat up quickly, his bleary eyes focusing on the metal box and its gray door. Something strange was happening. The previous panel was slowly rising from the earth, lifting itself back into its original position, covering the door that he hadn't yet opened. Morgan checked his watch. Exactly 90 minutes had elapsed since he had first breached the 18th door, and now that same door had locked itself back up. What did it mean? Why would that panel reverse itself and close again? He sat cross-legged on the ground, cradling his head between the palms of his hands, trying to comprehend this newest mystery. He ran through dozens of possibilities in his mind, dozens of reasons why the makers of this machine would create these specific situations. There seemed to be no logical reason for an open panel to close again. Time slipped by, while the practical mind of the engineer concentrated on the possible purpose behind the new twist in the mystery. Click! The loud noise pulled at Robert Morgan's brain, drawing his attention back to the box. The 17th panel was beginning to rise, slowly covering the 18th metal door and snapping closed into its original position. Morgan checked his watch. Exactly 90 minutes since the earlier closure. Now he had his answer. It was another pattern, a pat turn of time. If a new panel wasn't opened within 90 minutes, then the previous panel would automatically close. So now I've got a time limit, he muttered. Another question was now added to the puzzle of the box. Why a time limit? But there was no time to think about the reason. If he didn't continue to work on the proffered puzzles, then the box would close itself up, one door at a time, every 90 minutes, until the first panel once more showed its Forest Service green paint. He rubbed his palms into his tired eyes. No time to think, no time to rest, no time to ponder about reasons or purposes. He had to do nothing but work on the puzzles, nothing except remember each of the locking sequences. Time was running out. Morgan reopened the 17th panel in less than an hour, and the 18th panel took even less time since most of the opening combination was still fresh in his mind. But now, he was faced with number 19, with only 90 minutes to solve the riddle of the new instrumentation. It seemed like some insane college semester test, the kind where the professor uses a stopwatch, and it takes forever just to read the questions. This panel was much harder than all the others, but it was still solvable, taking 1 hour and 16 minutes to open. He hoped that this would be the last door to the inside of the machine, but he knew better. As number 19 slowly disappeared, number 20 came into full view. He checked his watch and began working on the new combination immediately. After 1 hour and 27 minutes, panel number 20 slid slowly downward, and there was number 21. A look of despair joined the fatigue that showed on Robert Morgan's face. He stared at the new technology on the smooth gray door, and he knew that the machine had won. Never before had he seen such instrumentation, devices that went beyond electrical and chemical into the realm of some sort of organic structure. Encased in the smooth metal face of the gray panel were tissue-like substances, and these were intricately connected within the various electrical, mechanical, and other components. There was a type of vine, or vein, pumping a strange yellow fluid between polygons of switches and levers. It seemed to be some futuristic merger between hardware and a living organism. It was the pinnacle of engineering, and Robert Morgan was truly impressed but stalemated. Taking a marking pen from his tool pouch, he wrote his name and the date on the blank gray metal of door number 21, beginning and ending with a loud click. At first, he tried to prevent the doors from closing. He tried placing objects to block the closures, pieces of wood and metal. Various tools, wedges, screwdrivers, blades, crowbars, and anything else he could think of. But nothing worked. The makers of the machine had constructed each panel so the upper edges were shaped and beveled to remove anything that might block its path of closure. In all of his years as an engineer, Robert Morgan had never seen such perfectly machined, precision-made equipment. The different parts of each panel, and the panels themselves, seemed to blend together, almost melting into one another. So finely did one part fit into or onto the next that the individual pieces seemed to form one single object. It was the perfect example of synergy in creation. By the light of his Black & Decker emergency lamp, Morgan spent the entire night watching and listening as each panel returned to its original position. It was misery spiced with fascination, and he continued to watch, witnessing each door slowly return from the earth, locking itself into its former place. Through the next morning and into the afternoon, he sat and stared at the marvelous machine, watching it lock itself up behind one puzzle after another. His long hours of work and hope vanished before his eyes. It had taken Robert Morgan over 12 hours to penetrate to the 21st panel, and now it would take the machine 30 hours to close itself completely. And Morgan would wait to see that very last door slide into its original place. Evening came, followed by the cool blackness of the deep night, and still he waited and watched. The batteries of his emergency lamp wore down around midnight, allowing the darkness of the forest to surround him, and still he waited. The craving for sleep tortured his tired eyes, but he needed to see the end. At 3:30 in the early morning, the final panel began to close. It was too dark for Morgan to see the door slip into place, but he had counted each closure and knew what was happening. He waited for the panel to lock itself shut. Click! He leaned forward and felt the rough paint of the metal box. Letting his fingers run across the 5 levers, forming the lopsided pentagon once more in its original position. Morgan realized for the first time exactly how little he had actually accomplished. In spite of the fact that he had opened 20 panels, the width of the box had been diminished by only 1.25 inches. He never got near the inside of the box. What was in all that space? What filled those many, many inches? What did the insides of the machine look like? Why did it need so much security? What did the machine do? Why was it here? Robert Morgan lay back on the soft ground, closing his eyes against the starry sky. He tried to think of ways to penetrate that 21st panel, mulling it over and over in his tired mind. Soon he fell asleep, and his dreams continued his questioning, stretching the reality into some kind of abstract character in a strange wonderland. The sun rose and scattered warm streams of light through the trees and across the engineer's face. He opened his eyes and sat up quickly. For a brief moment, it all seemed like a dream, but the box stood silently before him, surrounded by all his discarded tools, reminding him of the truth. He stood up and stretched his stiffening muscles. He gathered his tools, cleaned up the area, and started for home. He knew he would come back again to try and open that 21st panel. He needed to study to find the ways to relate biology with engineering principles, the key to the organic mechanical locks. But it would take time, perhaps more time than his future permitted. Robert Morgan shook his head and walked away, glancing over his shoulder at the peculiar box. It was a strange machine, no purpose to speak of, but instinctively he knew it was a machine. And step by step, since time began, I see the steady gain of man. Whittier, the Chapel of the Hermits. The pulses race through the cold, black void, traveling the speed of light toward a reddish planet in a distant orbit of the triple star system of Alpha Centauri. The pulses passed effortlessly through the thick mass of an intervening moon and spun onward with intrinsic angular momentum, unmolested in their speed or trajectory, hurtling on toward the reddish planet. The pulses broke through the planet's atmosphere and instantly reached the surface. Once again, they would pass on through the massive bulk of a planet. But this time, their passing would be monitored and measured. An entire field of electro-organic antennae stood in the path of these pulsed and directed neutrinos. The antennae were composed of a purified, super-concentrated chlorine compound. And as the racing neutrinos passed through the giant mass of these half-living receptors, they interacted with the internal chemistry, creating argon atoms of distinctly measurable quantities. A continuous process of microchemical sweeping would detect, gauge, and record the development and sequence of each new atom, along with the exact time intervals between each one. The patterns of the pulses that formed the argon atoms created a mathematical message, and that message was quickly transmitted from the antennae to an elaborate astronomical information network. The various numerical arrangements of the accumulated pulses and argon creations were fed into a series of rapid decryption computers. These computers quickly deciphered the specific atomic tally of argon clusters and sent the information on to an analytical processor that was wholly overlorded by artificial intelligence. The processor analyzed the information within the message and made an assessment of its substance and import. The analyses did not take long. The message contained very little. Monitor number 6419, levels 1 through 20. It only took a nanosecond for the overlord computer to correlate this information with past transmissions from the same source. The artificial intelligence quickly assessed the relevance of the information. The message came from a machine placed on a bluish planet in the third orbit around a small star with a 9-planet solar system. The machine had been installed several thousands of that young planet's solar revolutions ago. The last transmission received from this machine was 71 revolutions ago. That message was almost the same. It read, levels 1 through 17. The overlord computer considered the slight difference in these two transmissions and made an intelligent decision on their import and subsequent disposition. The transmission was recorded and placed in the history file of machine number 6419. The computer decided not to alert the custodians of the observatory since only a difference of 3 levels was involved. A 3-level increase in a 71 revolution period was interesting, but not extremely significant. Only 20 panels had been infiltrated, far less than the 100 needed for mandatory notification. After the history file was updated, the Overlord computer began to decipher and assess transmissions from other machines on other planets. The neutrinos pulsed in from every direction, thousands of messages from thousands of monitors, each placed on different planets throughout a universe teeming with life. It had taken less than a second to process that single message from the strange box on that distant blue planet. It was a simple message, brief and concise, but within that short transmission was a much larger understanding, an understanding of human life and its intellectual development. The message was easily interpreted. Intelligent life existed and was slowly developing on that primitive blue planet. It now measured at level 20 on the Universal Intelligence Scale. The monitor was working.